There was music playing. The quiet melody danced through the air around her. The dullest beats seemed to drag from each chord to the next, as though the instrument hadn't been played for years and was picked up to be played for that very moment. It sent a shiver down her to hear the haunting melody. The lavender unicorn treaded carefully forward, unable to see any light before her. She was compelled to keep moving forward, even though her destination was unclear. It had seemed like she had been traveling for a long time now. Her legs were sore, throbbing with every step she'd gone through. She couldn't recall everything, just the constant pain inside of her. It was then that she saw a light ahead of her. It was dull, only bright enough to show the details of the world around her, but it was a light. Stepping into it, she could finally make out the scenery that was around her. She was in Canterlot Castle. She would recognize her home anywhere, but the place had not fared well. The normally bright-colored tile floor was now entirely gray, rusted, and grime formed over the tiles. The walls, which once hosted regal paintings and decorations, now hosted the decay and grime that covered the floors. The walls themselves were no longer made of rock and gypsum, but now seemed to be made of blood-stained steel. The once regal stained glass mirrors now contained steel bars held together by a chain-link fence. The castle was built like a cage. The unicorn looked behind her, expecting to see the front door to Canterlot Castle. Instead, she saw a normal, dead-end hallway. Not even a hint that there had once been a door to the castle. However she had gotten into the place, she was trapped there now. She turned her attention back to the path before her. She knew the layout of the castle like the back of her hoof. Without wasting a movement, she ran forward. The main hall was just straight ahead. It was where Princess Celestia most often greeted expected visitors, standing at the top of her stairwell before the stained-glass images of the night and day. It didn't take long at all to reach the main hall, but when she reached it, she found herself stopped in her tracks. The hall was the same as everything else, falling apart, rotted, and stained with blood. But the biggest change was the large, imposing, stained-glass feature that now adorned the wall just above the stairs. It depicted Celestia as a large, towering figure in the center, the single visible eye colored a deep red. Houses and ponies were depicted below her, burning within flames that engulfed everything. The sun and moon sat above her, eclipsing one another. To each of her sides were two symbols. One, a red magic circle depicting 3 inner circles surrounded in runic lettering. The other was a black magic circle, this time depicting a triangle in the center, filled with strange, twisting, and contorting lines. The runic lettering around the circle seemed to go around the triangle, making it look similar to a clock. The unicorn's ears were hit by the sound of rattling chains. She craned her head upwards to the ceiling, spotting something like a chandelier shuddering and moving above her. The device hanging from the ceiling suddenly let out a large snap as it fell. The unicorn had only seconds to move, jumping out of the way of the falling thing that was coming straight for her. She dove for the floor and covered her head, expecting to hear a loud crash when it hit the floor. Instead, she heard the entire device rattle and shake, as if it had come to a sudden stop mid-air. The sound was followed by a pain-filled, horrifying screech that echoed through the main hall. The unicorn lifted her head and looked back at the horrific sound. What she had thought was a chandelier appeared to be a gigantic set of ornamental decorations, usually adorned by royalty. A giant crown was fused to the top. A tiara was hanging from the side. Regal armor and hanging pendants hang from the crown. Underneath all the decorations was a creature, looking as if it had been welded to the regalia. Its skin was decaying, its back arched up into the crown, and it only took 2 back legs that looked painfully malformed. Its mouth hung loose and let out a loud, pitching wail, revealing a row of flat, broken teeth that aligned its mouth. The regalia shifted and hung from a line in the ceiling. The creature flailed its wailing body, trying to reach the lavender unicorn, wanting to sink its teeth down into her flesh. The lavender unicorn didn't wait around for the creature to get closer to attack. She turned and ran up the stairs, quickly making her escape. The unicorn ran straight for the hallways that she was familiar with. She wasn't sure what it was, where she wanted to run. She wanted to find her mentor, the one who taught her and practically acted as a second mother to her. She ran down the hallway, her hooves beating loudly against the bloody metal floor at her feet. She could feel the soft splatter of blood strike her hooves with every step. The hallway she ran down felt almost endless, unable to see anything too far ahead of her, as it was hidden by the darkness. She ran as the steel-caged windows went by her. She could see no light from outside the windows, or even if there was a sky out there. Her hooves carried her further. As the hallway continued to move, it seemed to change upon itself. The ground seemed to grow hotter, the walls seemed to turn a brighter red, and the room seemed to begin to morph. The steel-caged windows began to transform into the caged bars, into stained glass depictions of ponies. Each stained glass seemed to depict a different scene. One depicted a pony being burned to death at a stake. Another showed 2 ponies clashing, each with a different weapon and set of armor. Another portrayed a pony being hanged from a cord held by the moon. Another depicted a mother throwing her child to hungry alligators below. Another showed a pony standing over a corpse of another, a bloody knife in its mouth. Another presented a dead angel being carried in the arms of a crestfallen pony. The images blurred by and filled the unicorn with a sense of dread upon seeing them. But not for a moment did she stop running through the hallway that seemed to have no end, running straight for the darkness ahead of her. 2 piercing red eyes appeared in the darkness that she was running towards. She didn't slow for a moment, as the eyes seemed to stare. The darkness that she was running towards began to spread through the hallway. It coiled and wrapped around the structures and stained glass windows, spreading faster than she was running. The darkness crept past her and engulfed the entire hallway in darkness. The eyes faded back into the shadows as the lavender unicorn ran. She ran into the infinite darkness, never knowing where she was being led. Twilight stirred in her bed, feeling the end of a fitful sleep. She rubbed her head as she sat up into bed, groggily yawning. Her nightmare seemed to linger for a moment in her mind, still present, yet somehow fading. She hadn't had such a restless night of sleep in a long time, but she didn't put much thought into it now. She blinked several times, rubbing her eyes with a hoof as she tried to get an eyeful of her room to determine the time. However, things simply remained dark. It's too early to be waking up, she grumbled to herself, for waking up at such a bad dream, before sinking back into the soft covers of her bed and closing her eyes to rest. She tossed around in her bed, getting comfortable once more. She would spend a few minutes in one position, before tossing into a new one and trying to return to slumber. The pattern continued until she finally grew frustrated with her own inability to go back to sleep. She sat up once more and rubbed at her eyes, trying to clear the sleep and drowsiness from them. As she blinked to try and examine her room again, she found herself blind. She raised a hoof to her face and waved it, trying to determine how dark it was. The hoof touched her forehead, and yet it was still too dark that she could not see. "What the?" Twilight whispered, confused. Turning her head in the direction of where she knew her window to be, on any normal night, there would be a moon and natural lights of Ponyville shining through. allowing her to at least see the faint details of her room in the darkened light. However, the window seemed just as muted as the rest of her room. And this darkness that was surrounding her wasn't natural. Okay, what's going on? She grunted to herself as she concentrated, her horn flaring up with a magic light spell that illuminated the room in front of her. The familiar room appeared before her groggy eyes, before she turned to look at the window, letting out a short gasp. On the window, on the outside piece of plywood had been hammered against it, blotting out the sun, or moon, from piercing through. Oh, of all the no-good pranks! Twilight sighed, turning her head to the lanterns that hung around her room. With a swift flick of her magic, the lanterns burned brightly, filling the room with light once more. She dimmed her horn as she heard her young dragon assistant groaning at the sudden intrusion of light. Is it morning already? Spike groaned, sitting up with a yawn and rubbing his eyes. Most likely, Spike, Twilight said, getting up from her bed. It seems some pony put up plywood to block the morning sunlight. It was probably Rainbow Dash, getting in one last prank before she leaves for her honeymoon. Twilight motioned with her hoof to the window. Oh, Spike said, scratching his head a little confused. Weird prank, then. He stretched from his little cot, hopping out and headed for the door downstairs. I guess I'll go get breakfast ready, then. That's very thoughtful of you, Spike. Twilight smiled as she watched her assistant head off. What's the number one assistant for, anyways? Spike grinned as he made his way down the stairs. Twilight smiled happily at his energy after just having woken up, and walked over to her bedroom mirror. She levitated the resting comb up and began to brush her hair. It certainly wasn't a disheveled mess, but it needed a good combing. She was quickly going over the events of yesterday in her mind, over how she worried about organizing the wedding and being glad that everything came through, over how beautiful the ceremony itself had been, how Celestia had confided in her with some strange secret. Oh, that's right. Twilight turned her head to look out the barricaded window. I wonder if she was successful at what she had to do. Twilight pondered this thought for a moment, before simply smiling. Of course she did. She's the princess. When she sets her mind to something, she always succeeds. Relieved with her own revelation, she gently levitated the brush back down onto the nightstand. Huh? What's this? Twilight asked, puzzled, looking at something that hadn't been on her nightstand before. A small, thin brown box sat there. On top of it was a sliding puzzle consisting of 15 pieces that formed a scrambled puzzle. She couldn't decipher it by simply looking at it. She levitated the strange box so she could see it better. The box had a hinge on one side, and seemed to open down the middle of it. Twilight shook the box gently, hearing something rattle inside of it. She tried to pry open the box to see what it contained, only to find it was locked soundly. She stared at the puzzle for a moment, and then a thought clicked in her head. Oh, I see. The picture must be the locking mechanism. If I solve it, the box will open. She smiled as she began to move the tiles on the box, each sliding motion giving a satisfying click as she worked. Twilight! Spike suddenly shouted, rushing back into the room, interrupting Twilight's puzzle solving. What is it, Spike? Twilight asked, confused at the sudden urgency of the baby dragon, putting the box down back onto the desk. It's not just the bedroom window. It's the whole house. Spike pointed down the stairs with urgency. The whole house? Twilight said, dumbstruck by this. She quickly followed Spike out of her room and down to the lower floors of the library. Sure enough, as she looked around, every single window she could spot was boarded up tight with the same plywood, blocking any light from entering. Spike had already lit as many lanterns around the house as he could, illuminating the interior of the library for them. Okay, what the hey? Twilight demanded, walking to the front door. Her horn lit up, and grabbed hold of the boards and pushed at it to open, as she was going to go to the bottom of this elaborate prank. Twilight ran face first into the door. She stepped back a few paces and shook her head, rubbing her snout. The door remained firmly locked before her. She glared at the door and lit it up with magic once more, pushing and pulling on it to try and force it open. The door refused to budge an inch, however, no matter how much force Twilight applied. Why is the door locked? Why can't I open it? Okay, this prank has gone far enough. How am I supposed to see Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy off on their honeymoon if I can't even leave my house? She groaned, walking up to the door with a hoof and trying to use the handle. It was then that she noticed something new was on the door that hadn't been there before. A new lock had been installed into the center of the door. It seemed that the lock was holding the door in place. Spike, give me the book that has the lock-picking spell in it. Twilight spoke calmly. Right away. Spike saluted before dashing across the library to grab the ladder. He wheeled it over to section 2 before climbing up the shelf G. He grabbed the book from the shelf and waved it. Here it is. A Guide to Locks and Mechanisms. Spike grinned happily at the book as it was suddenly engulfed in light. Whoa! Spike cried out as Twilight's magic dragged him and the book over, causing him to smash into the floor. Oh, sorry, Spike, Twilight said quickly, helping him up and dusting him off. I'm just a bit frustrated. I don't want this to hinder us from our plans today. Yeah, I understand. Spike sighed softly. While you figure this out, I'm going to go ahead and make breakfast. The young purple dragon quickly headed for the kitchen to start preparing their meals. All right, lockpicking. Twilight quickly flipped through the pages, looking for just the right spell. Aha! She spoke aloud, acquiring the knowledge she sought. With a quick scan of the page, she memorized the spell and closed the book. Her horn ignited with more magic. Let's get this lock out of the way. She pointed her horn at the door, a stream of magic firing forth and straight into the lock. She heard the tumblers moving and grinding around inside of the lock before she finally heard a loud click, telling her that the spell had worked. Finally, now let's see what's going on. The door gave a jarring click as Twilight tried to open it, telling her that the lock was firmly secured. Hey! Twilight glared at the door before igniting her magic and casting the spell once more. The lock whirled and grinded once more as the spell danced inside of the lock, before finishing with another loud click. Twilight pushed on the door once more, the door resisting with another click. Ah! Twilight growled in frustration and cast the spell once more. As the spell worked on the lock, Twilight grabbed the handle with both hooves and frustratingly shook the door, trying to pry it open. Even as the spell finished with the usual click, it refused to open. Twilight sat back on her haunches and rubbed her head in frustration. For some reason, the lock-picking spell was working, yet it wasn't. Maybe there's an anti-magic enchantment on the lock, Spike said, walking into the living room. With him, 2 plates containing their breakfast, a daisy sandwich for Twilight, and a small pile of common turquoise that he'd been given after the reception. Well, if another unicorn enchanted it, it'd be rarity. But she isn't the type to prank ponies, especially not like this. Twilight grumbled, walking over the table Spike had placed her breakfast onto. She took a bite, trying to figure this out in her head. Maybe Celestia enchanted it? Spike asked curiously, stuffing a gem into his mouth. Don't be silly, Spike. The princess wouldn't go so far with something like this. Not when I have something as important as seeing my friends off planned out. Twilight rolled her eyes. Though, perhaps we can use her to get out of here. Twilight smiled. Spike, quickly, grab a quill and parchment. Can do, Spike said, stuffing a few more gems into his mouth, before rushing off and slowly returning with the quill and paper. All right. Dear Princess Celestia, Twilight began. Spike quickly began writing away. I'm writing to you because it appears that some prankster has boarded up my house and made it impossible for me to leave. The door has been sealed with a magic-resistant lock, and I can't seem to open it. Since I assume you're still in town, I was hoping you could stop by and help me out, so I can continue with my day. Your faithful student, Twilight Sparkle. Done and done, Spike said, punctuating the letter with finality before rolling the scroll up. With a quick inhale, he held the scroll up and exhaled a brilliant emerald flame upon the message. The paper, alight from the green flame, quickly succumbed to the heat and fell into a pile of ashes onto the floor. Spike! I told you to send the letter, not burn it! Twilight sighed exasperatedly with her assistant's work. But that's how I always send the letters, Spike said, baffled. He quickly pulled out a spare scroll of paper and quickly rewrote Twilight's letter. He rolled it up once more and held it up. Okay, this is how I've sent every letter in the past. He spoke quickly, remembering his lessons on how to send things properly with his green fire. He inhaled expertly before spewing out another emerald flame out of the paper. Once more the message was burnt to ashes and joined the other pile on the floor. Wait, so we can't send letters to the princess either? Twilight asked, shocked at this revelation. I guess so, Spike said, just as confused as Twilight. I'm starting to think this isn't just some prank then, Twilight said, turning to look back at the door. This is too elaborate to be some joke. Who could have done this? I don't know. No pony in Ponyville is capable of preventing me from sending Spike stopped mid-sentence, as suddenly his eyes bulged, and he closed his mouth. His cheeks bulged as he put his hands over his stomach. Twilight quickly turned to look at her dragon assistant, as suddenly he let out a loud belch, smoke and fire spewing out and circling above his head before forming in a burst of magic into a scroll. Huh? Maybe she got a letter anyway, Twilight said, confused, quickly levitating the scroll over her and opening it. If this was a letter from Celestia, it was the weirdest letter Twilight had ever received from the princess. The scroll was marked with random designs and scribbled all over, done mostly in black, but with some sections in red. She concentrated hard on the scroll, and thought she could see something written underneath the scribbled masks. It seemed that the sections in red contained the actual message that had been scribbled over by the sections in black. What's it say? Spike asked, unable to see the mess of a document. I'm not sure. I'm going to find out, though, Twilight said, pushing her sandwich aside before laying the scroll down on the table flat. As she pushed the plate aside, it bumped into something, knocking it off the table. This caught Spike's attention, and walked around the table to pick it up. Twilight concentrated with her magic, and quickly scanned the scroll with it, before pulling the black ink straight off the page. Another blank scroll was levitated over to her side, and she cleanly placed the black ink onto the scroll, creating two separate documents. She glanced upon the scroll that was now containing the words written in red ink, and read carefully. For what has happened, there is no apology. Twisted by the revelation under the guise of relief, hollowed full, hurt and shocked. Their sight finds no light, no remorse, no regret, no apology, no return. The letter was almost incomprehensible. It was as if it was intended for her to read, but the message had been hidden underneath sketched-up nonsense. Then the top of the letter had strange capitalization, as if the writer had no concept of where words needed to be punctuated. Hey, Twilight, we always have this? Spike asked, confused, causing Twilight's attention to rise from the note. In Spike's hands looked like some kind of small box, made of some sort of mahogany. Let me see that, Twilight asked. Spike handed it over as Twilight quickly inspected the box. The box had a seam near the top, and small hinges indicating that it was meant to be opened. On the side she could see a small hole that led into the device. When Twilight tried to open it, she found that it was locked, obviously needing something in the hole to open it. That was what Twilight looked up at Spike, thoughts beginning to form to each other. Spike, there's no way this is a prank any longer. Twilight put the box down and stood up from her spot. I need you to quickly search around this floor of the library for anything and everything that wasn't here before we went to sleep. I'm going to go search upstairs for the same things. I understand, Spike said, quickly returning to his plate to scarf down the rest of his gems before searching. Twilight quickly made her way back to the upper floor, swiftly returning to her bedroom. On the nightstand, she could see the strange puzzle device that she had been inspecting earlier. She quickly gathered it, and with her magic, and looked around her room carefully. There were the usual strewn books, Spike's small cluttered mess that he called a bed, various decorations and reminders of her stay in Ponyville the last year, and not seeing anything out of the ordinary, she made her way to the bathroom. Lighting up the bathroom with his lantern, it seemed to be the same at first glance. Towels were where they should be, the bathtub was empty, and the mirror above the sink reflected her image as always. However, on the sink, alongside the usual sundries, was a newer brown bottle. The label read, "Health Drink," on it. Twilight levitated the drink, as well as quickly headed back downstairs, certain she hadn't missed anything else obvious. She saw Spike was still searching quickly around the library, trying not to leave any space untouched. Twilight quickly walked over to the table and placed down her 2 items and quickly re-examined what they already had. It only took Spike another minute before he returned to the table, carrying another note. "This was the only other thing I could find," Spike said, looking at the note over. "It says, 'When all is lost, when the darkness is at its strongest, when all is cold and bleak, you'll find the light?' What do you think it means?" Spike asked, placing it next to the rest of the strange items. "I'm not sure, Spike. I don't even know what these things are doing here, but I plan to find out," Twilight said quickly, scanning through the various items on the table. There were 3 notes, 2 of which were part of the same one that she had split in half, 2 boxes, one with a sliding puzzle on top, and the strange health drink bottle. "But I'm going to figure this out." Twilight quickly grabbed the quill Spike had used to write his letter, and brought it over to the first letter she had read. Something about the way it was written was bothering her, and she just couldn't leave it as it was. She reread the note once more, before putting the quill to the bottom of the note. She quickly wrote down each of the capitalized letters in the order that they appeared. "They are watching?" Twilight looked up and around her house. There was no one there except her and Spike. How would it be possible for anyone to watch them? "That was in a letter from the princess?" Spike asked, scratching his head. "This just doesn't seem like a letter from Celestia." "That's what worries me about all this," Twilight said. Her concern in her voice was apparent. "Hopefully, opening these boxes will yield some answers. And, since I don't see a way to open this box yet," Twilight said, moving the mahogany box to the side, "I'll try and open this one first." She levitated the sliding picture box into her sight and began clicking away at the puzzle. "What is it a picture of?" Spike asked curiously, watching Twilight work away. "I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure that out right now so I can solve this thing easier." She concentrated on getting several pieces to match up so that she could figure it out sooner. Spike watched carefully, adding his input, much to Twilight's discontent. It took several minutes before she started to see a pattern forming in the image. As she clicked the pieces together and started seeing the full image, she simply grew more confused. "It's some kind of circle pattern?" Spike asked, confused. "It's not one I've ever seen," Twilight said, just as confused, still clicking the pieces away. She could make out the general shape of the picture now. She could see where the piece was able to go, and was able to complete the puzzle with much more efficiency. It took her just a moment to complete the picture. The completed picture was a red symbol containing 2 large circles, filled with strange cryptic runic writing, while inside these 2 circles were 3 smaller circles, also surrounded by the strange writing. When Twilight completed the box, it let out one satisfying click, telling Twilight that she had solved the puzzle correctly. Happy with her work, she opened the box. Its contents revealed nothing more than a music box key. Twilight carefully lifted it up, examining the piece. She then looked over at the second box on the table, noticing that the small hole in the side was about the same size as the end of the music box key. "Really?" Twilight groaned. "I opened up one box to get the key to another?" She sighed, before lifting up the second box now and slipping the key into the keyhole. It fit snugly inside of the small opening, and it seemed to stick. She slowly turned the key, hearing the gears grind inside of the device with each turn. Spike watched carefully, grabbing hold of the table as Twilight cranked the key. With one final turn, the small box clicked. Twilight reached to open the box, where the lid suddenly flipped open of its own accord. Something suddenly burst out of the box, rising into the air. Twilight nearly dropped the box in surprise by the action, but whatever it was hit her ceiling and exploded into a burst of light. Spike and Twilight shielded their eyes from the blast, waiting for the light to dim. Once they did, they blinked and looked up in the air, seeing a small shower of sparkling lights falling to the floor. "What's all this about?" Spike asked, unsettled by the strange display that had erupted from the box. "Have you finished the preparations?" A familiar, regal voice said from behind them. Twilight and Spike instantly snapped their heads around, seeing the translucent figure of Princess Celestia standing there. "This is an important night, after all." Twilight opened her mouth to speak to the image of the princess, only for it to be interrupted a second later by a second, familiar, regal voice. "We have ensured the preparations for the facilities. Thou needn't worry. Thy subjects will be safe with us." The dumbfounded unicorn and dragon turned their heads back around, seeing a familiar, translucent image of the dark blue alicorn with a dark, magical mane, Princess Luna, walking towards Celestia. "Now, thou should go, so that thou are not late. Thou should not keep thy friends waiting." "Very well. Thank you for everything, Luna." Celestia bowed her thanks before turning around and quickly heading out. "'Tis nothing, dear sister. We shall always be willing to help thee." Luna smiled. The falling sparks of light faded from the world, leaving the two in a state of awestruck dismay. They could not find the will to believe what had just happened. "What the hey was that about?" Spike finally broke the silence, throwing his hands into the air. "Images of the princesses? I've never seen magic like that before. What's going on here, Twilight?" "Spike?" Twilight spoke softly, uneasily. "I don't know. I really wish I did know. I'm getting a very bad feeling about all this. Right now, I need to find some pony. Preferably Princess Celestia. But if I can find my friends, they can help us out too. After all, we can do anything as long as we're together." Twilight smiled reassuringly before looking inside the box she had just opened. "Hey, what's this doing in here?" Twilight levitated a thin, stringed pendant with a point-cut crystal with a decorative silver frame. "Hey, isn't that the pendant used to search for books in the Canterlot archives?" Spike asked, curious about the device. It is, Spike. But what's it doing in the box?" Twilight looked at it curiously, twirling it around with her magic. She then concentrated and poured some of her magic into the device, it lighting up brightly. "Well, it seems to be functioning all right," she commented, before gently wrapping the pendant around her neck for safekeeping. "I'll hold on to it till we can return to Celestia." With that said, Twilight checked inside the box once more to see if there was anything else left behind. "Hey, a key!" Twilight said, surprised at her discovery. She pulled the thin skeleton key out of the box and examined it. "Do you think it's the key to the front door?" Spike asked, looking over at the locked door. "Only one way to find out," Twilight said, turning to the door and walking over to it. She guided the long key into the door and heard the tumblers clicking into place. With a quick turn of the key, she heard the door let out another click, telling her that it should be unlocked. Though, after having heard the sound several times, she admittedly had her doubts. She raised a hoof to the door and pressed against it to see if her actions had worked. The door swung open noisily, as if the hinges hadn't been used in years and were rusted over, a fact that seemed strange to Twilight. However, once she opened the door, all thoughts of the creaky hinges left her mind. A thick sheet of fog sat just outside of her doorframe, surrounding all of Ponyville within the confines of its embrace. Twilight couldn't even see the houses across the street. The fog only allowed her a few feet of visibility. "Holy guacamole! I've never seen weather like this in Ponyville before," Spike said, shocked, looking at the fog himself. He stepped outside of the doorframe and waved his hand through it quickly. Some of the fog moved in his actions, but quickly was replaced by some more fog. Twilight continued to stare in disbelief at the sight before her. Rainbow Dash wouldn't have let fog like this cover Ponyville. Never, in any of the weather forecasts in Ponyville, had it been called for the town to be shrouded in fog. Were weather ponies trying to desperately clean it away? How was it even possible to have such a freak fog covering just suddenly appear overnight? And this much fog would take a while to build up, not to mention there would be warnings over it being placed over the town. Everything about this was unnatural. "I wanted you to know, so that if you see anything strange, you'll be prepared." Celestia's words suddenly came back to Twilight, awaking her from her stupor like a splash of cold water to her face. Twilight quickly turned back around and ran back to the table. "Twilight?" Spike asked, turning to see the strange actions of his unicorn mentor. Twilight quickly levitated each of the remaining items onto the table, accounting for the 3 notes and the health drink. She closed her eyes and concentrated, creating a pocket inside of her magic reservoir. The 4 items disappeared from the world and found a home inside this pocket. She then turned around, looking at Spike seriously. "Twilight, why do you look so serious?" Spike said, unnerved more by the serious-looking Twilight than anything else that had happened this morning. "Spike, I'm heading out into Ponyville. I need you to stay here and make sure nothing Twilight stopped suddenly as her eyes widened, her mouth dropping and her pupils dilating. Spike lay on the ground before her, his body dismembered and the separate pieces scattered around the floor. His hot blood was spattered everywhere, including on her coat. Scratched claw marks, trailing blood, were along the walls where the tiny dragon had tried to escape from its attacker. The blood burned against her coat, telling her that it was all her fault. She wanted to scream, to cry, but her voice caught in her throat and choked her. "Twilight!" Spike called out, causing Twilight's head to snap back, her eyes looking at her dragon assistant standing by the doorway. She quickly scanned the room, trying to find traces of the horrific scene she had just witnessed. "Twilight, you're scaring me. What is it you want me to do?" Twilight couldn't speak for a moment. She felt completely shaken by the vision she had just suddenly seen, one which she couldn't understand. She only knew one thing that the vision told her. If she had left Spike in the library, something horrible was going to happen to him. "Change of plans, Spike," Twilight spoke, swallowing the fear that had lodged itself into her throat. "You're coming with me. We're going out to find Princess Celestia." "Oh, well, okay," Spike said, before looking out of the door at the fog and back to Twilight. "Hold on, let me go get something," Spike said, before quickly heading over to one of the shelves. Twilight watched him with a bit of curiosity, before the dragon returned carrying a large rolled-up paper. "We should bring a map of Ponyville, since we won't be able to see clearly in the fog." He grinned happily. Twilight blinked oddly at the dragon, before smiling at him. The dragon's sentiments seemed to affect her even more at that very moment. "Good thinking, Spike. This is why you're my #1 assistant." Twilight gave her praise to the dragon, who took it with his usual ego. Twilight didn't leave him much time to speak, however, wrapping him gently in her magic before lifting him up and placing him on her back. "Let's go figure out what's wrong with the town," Twilight said, confidently turning to the door. As long as Spike was with her, she knew she could handle anything the strange fog was going to throw at her. The two of them wandered quickly into the strangely silent Ponyville.